Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I am so stoked to have you. We are going to go on an adventure together about a topic that is really exciting because I'm going to teach you how to differentiate between your ego and your highest self. That is a big question among people in the spiritual community, no doubt. And I'm here to answer all your questions about it. I am so stoked. So let's begin. Actually, before we begin, I really want to say that I am quite genuinely thankful for you to be here today, and your attendance during this training means so much to me, and it would really mean so much more if you could like and subscribe if you find any of this information useful. And yeah, so that's it. Let's begin. What is your ego first and foremost? Because there is a lot of misconceptions around what the ego is and why it's bad, and really these things are just making the ego seem worse than it really actually is. There's a lot of misinformation about the ego out there. I know that's kind of a buzzword, but it really is true. And a lot of people in the spiritual community think that they have to, in order to ascend, have an ego death, which really, I don't want to kill the ego. The ego is a part of us. So, really, I like to work instead with the ego. And that's what we're going to talk about today so that we could learn to integrate our highest good with our earthly ego that exists in the 3D realm. You can't have a spiritual side if you don't have an earth side as well. So, this will really help create a divide between the two of what the ego is and its purpose and what the highest self is and that their purpose as well. So, in terms of ego death and why you don't need to do it, why you need to avoid ego death, I want to be really contradictory here from what you usually hear in the spiritual community. I don't want to kill your ego. There's lots of people who go on like uh, trip after trip after trip in terms of literally tripping, going on like ayahuasca trips and retreats, uh, bofa frogs, and it's just, or sorry, not bofa, bufo frogs, and the cacao and the LSD and the DMT, like these are just things that people will chase after, and I find a lot of the time these spiritual gurus are going on these trips so that they could ascend and up level or quantum leap or whatever. um and it's not necessary. Like I dabble in plant medicine myself, but I don't make this big production of doing these things in order to reach a level that I could do on my own. And they say that, all these drugs, you are capable of achieving the same state with just your mind. And it takes a lot of practice, but I like that practice. It's just something that is a byproduct of the practice that I'm doing, and mine in particular is meditation. And that's one of the things you could use to help differentiate between your ego and your highest self, and we'll get into that later. So I don't want to keep you. I'll try to keep this like 15 to 20 minutes. So really, I want to break down first what the ego is and why it's important so that we want to avoid ego death. Your ego is yourself. It is your mind. It is part of being in a human body. There is no escaping it. Your mind is in your brain. And really, your ego is your identity. And ego is a bad thing and gets in the way when your identity becomes too concrete, because it's not your true nature. Being in a human body is not your true nature. Your spiritual self is your true nature. And so when you get stuck in a 3D realm, and the more you attach yourself to your identity, the more the ego stands in the way. So really, it's important because it does help you find your place in the world. It helps you establish your beliefs and your values and your motivations. It's when the ego takes over that it's bad, and it seeks to validate itself. And it does that through things like instant gratification, um, substance use, things that are like really earthly and have a lot of gratification but necessarily aren't good for your soul. They're very like bodily attachments. So when you get attached to your ego, that's when it gets in the way, and that's when we want to intervene and kind of address what's happening there. So the ego exists because your survival is dependent on it. It identifies your desires, it is your self-esteem. If you have a fragile ego, you might be triggered a lot, and these trigger defenses are your ego. Your ego is meant to keep you safe, and that's why it's so critical, because we have a very negative bias, because we wouldn't survive if we didn't have this negative bias. Everything would be too we would trust too much, and then it would bite us in the butt. So we don't want that. There's a harmony we want to create between our living in a higher reality that doesn't exist with the bad stuff at the same time, and that's just, we can't achieve that. We need both. We need a harmony between what can happen that's bad and what can happen that's good, and the highest self is the good part and the ego is the bad part. And it's, I don't want to say it's bad, it's just, it's negative and positive and dark and light. So that's how they integrate. And so your ego can be very fragile if you're very attached to the identity that you have, and if your identity is based off of external validation, like societal conditioning, and you might be moving in a way that's not congruent to how you want, but it matches to what people expect of you, and so therefore your self-esteem is built off that. That's where the ego comes in. We don't want to kill it, we just want to tone it down and work in congruence with it. So why your practices don't take you deep enough for you to um, really ascend to where you want to be is because you're so attached to the ego, which is very superficial and very it thinks outside of itself, so it needs tools as opposed to finding the answer from within, and that's where you connect with the divine and your highest self. So that's why these ayahuasca and LSD trips and DMT trips aren't, they don't, they serve their purpose. I'm not poo-pooing on it at all. As a shaman, it's very, plant medicine is very, very helpful, especially if you integrate it into your life in a positive way that empowers you. But I don't believe in just constantly doing it to go through the trip and killing your ego as much as possible so that you could ascend. You are here to live as a human being. It does not serve you well to just constantly be trying to ascend all the time when you are just meant to be. So there's that balance again. So when you go deep enough and you learn to integrate your ego into your life in a positive way, that's true ego death. That's where personal growth and transformation comes from. When you are able to override the superficiality and external validation from the ego, and then you ascend into something that's more aligned with how you want to feel on the inside and validating yourself. I hope that makes sense. So there's 3 questions you could ask yourself to decipher if it's your ego or if it's your higher self. And there's 3 different types of questions, and it would be motivation question, an identity question, or your response to challenges. So a motivation question would be, what is motivating my actions and my decisions right now? And that encourages you to self-reflect and identify if your motivation is internal and aligned with your values and your beliefs, or if it's external and you're seeking validation outside of yourself and you're not acting in congruence with how you want. You're just either people pleasing, or you're being hyper vigilant and masking yourself and not being true to who you are and your authenticity. And that's when the ego is taking over. So an identity inquiry would be, what aspects of my identity am I attached to? Where am I resisting change, and how is it protecting me, serving me? It might keep you safe, but it also might keep you stuck. So that's where we want to learn to respond to challenges. And that's when the third type of question comes in. These challenges can also be internal, because when you start to learn to ascend beyond the ego in a healthy way, it's because you're challenging that limiting programming that's coming up that would come from an external source. Excuse me. So that question would sound like, how do I react in moments of conflict or challenge? Are you really defensive? Do you have a fixed mindset? Is it based off of fear or anxiety or anger? Is it old trauma coming up? These are the questions that you could ask yourself and then decipher what your natural response is. Is it ego-based or is it higher self-based? Higher self-based would be calm, patient, understanding, loving, compassionate. It's more of a response than a reaction. Ego is very reactive and higher self is very responsive. So that's another way you could clearly differentiate between the two. So I really, really, really want to make this easy for you so that you could start to learn to integrate both when you realize which ones, if you're teetering off to one side or the other. And you want to keep that balance. It might be good to always act in alignment with your higher self, but you have your 3D body to consider as well. You have this realm to consider as well. And in order to up level, you need to integrate both. So this is how you would balance, is to decipher what the ego sounds like and what the higher self sounds like. So the ego, just to summarize, is about personal desires. These desires might be good or they might be bad if they're like greedy or if they're self-centered or if they hurt other people. These would be, you're doing what you want for the wrong reasons. That's very ego-based. And it's external validation, like I said, to be popular, especially if it's among the wrong crowd, like cults, for example. That's very ego-driven. Narcissists are very ego-driven, for example. You find a lot of narcissists inside cults for those very reasons, or even boss positions, because they don't make good employees. So then you start to learn to not only see your ego, you also see it in others and where they're operating from, which really, it helps you. It helps you survive. It helps you decipher who you want to surround yourself with and how you want to move in this world, and the things that you consume and what drives you. So it really is integrating the good aspects of your ego, but it can sound very negative if it's not being used in the right way. For example, it's very shaped by societal norms. Like, we're expected to constantly be codependent on one another and to shy away from negative emotions, and being very superficial and really lack scarcity, fear, anxiety, anger. All those emotions are very, very embedded in the ego. And if you constantly say, like, I am an angry person, or I am a jealous person, or I am a petty person, you're constantly identifying yourself with those rigid labels. And that is the ego just constantly reinforcing itself, and then it gets you even more stuck, and then it gets out of control. It identifies too much with labels, and that's why I want you to ask yourself, what part of my identity am I attached to, and is it serving me well? And then you could learn to start to move maybe in a different way, and that's when you would move into the higher self. So I want you to recognize that the ego, despite serving its purpose, sounds very critical, very negative. Just know that when it's going off in your head, because then it's really easy to decipher, is this me or is this my ego that's running the show right now? So for your highest self, I want you to realize that it is not of the mind. The ego is the mind. The highest self is not of the mind, and that's why it's always loving and compassionate and patient, because it's not being attached to like our temperament and our personality traits and our our neuroticism and things like that. It's not attached to our person, our identity at all. It is beyond us. And it is really just our connection with the divine and the higher consciousness. It is about unity and interconnectedness, that we are all one. So therefore, there's no selfishness behind it. There's no narcissism behind being in alignment with your highest self. It's not, there's no external validation driving you. It's in alignment with the values that you want to have, that are universal, like being a good person, honest, showing up with integrity, having accountability, discipline, things like that. These are all like common values that a lot of people want to hold if they want to strive to be a good person, straight up. So it's about aligning with those true values and that inner truth that you have, that you hear if your ego isn't, being loud and overriding it. So it's very compassionate, very loving. It's essentially what God would feel like when people who believe in God and they talk about his love. That's where that loving, compassionate piece, and there's no judgment there. There's no inner critic like the ego. Like I said, the ego is very critical and very negative. The highest self is nothing but like a loving, patient parent. They don't enable you. They love you, and they want the best for you, and that is straight up. It is unconditional love, and it is empathy for you, so that you can learn to start moving through the world with grace instead of constantly criticizing yourself and coming from the ego. So this is how you would differentiate between the ego and your highest self. It's really that easy when you start to learn that the ego is very loud, it's very critical, it's very negative, and the highest self is like a gentle parent who only wants the best for you and doesn't cause any trauma and doesn't have all these worldly limitations. It's very, you can do it, honey. I believe in you. That's your highest self. It's so I want you to keep that in mind when you hear that inner critic going off in your mind and it's really noisy and really negative and limiting. Just know that it is your ego and it's trying to run the show, and it does that to keep you safe. Remember, it's a survival aspect. So you need to survive. That's why it's important. That's why we want to work with it. But I want you to remember to keep it balanced between your highest self, so you're not living in la la land, and your ego, so that you're not trapped in a very, low vibration, self-centered, self-limiting place that just spirals downward. You want to create balance between the two so that you could integrate. So how you want to do that, and this is a bonus thing if you've gotten this far, is through self-awareness and mindfulness. And I talk about this a lot, and I might sound like a broken record after a while, but really working on being present and becoming self-aware is very important for personal development and transformation. It keeps you growing, it keeps you accountable, and it helps you recognize patterns that aren't serving you and that are ego driven. And so when you cultivate more self-awareness, and you do that through mindfulness techniques like meditation or journaling or even exercising, like you'll start to tune out that noise that the ego creates, and you'll realize what your true self feels like and what your true self sounds like. So when you practice mindfulness and being in the moment, whether it's breath work or meditation or sound therapy or whatever you want to do that keeps you present, even if it's like simple grounding techniques, and then recognizing, really taking that pause when you're in the moment to recognize, are my actions derived from my ego right now, or am I in alignment with my higher self? So how mindful you are would be your connection with the highest self, because your mindfulness brings you back to the present moment, tunes out the noise. That's why breath work is so important. It helps you tune out that noise as well. And that's when you're able to get clarity and you can hear your higher self and hear that quiet voice that's always drowned out. So that's how you would do that with mindfulness techniques. So I want you to remember that it is transcending the ego, not killing the ego, and you think of integration. So there's that balance that you want to keep. And that will be your growth and transformation. This will help you reprogram and expand your mind from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, from being rigid, very rigid and concrete and attached to those identity pieces, and realizing your infinite potential by connecting with a higher consciousness. So I want you to remember, finding that harmony is key for empowering transformation. You need the ego to live, though, so that you can live in alignment with your highest self, because it does provide you that stark contrast, so that you can analyze, am I moving in congruence with my higher self? And that's where the dichotomy, the duality of life comes in, that dark versus light, that negative versus positive. So I hope this was helpful for you. I'm a little out of breath because I'm talking so much, but I really appreciate your patience. If this was helpful for you, please like and subscribe and share. Otherwise, if you want to learn more, I am releasing a masterclass very shortly, here in about a week, and it is about a rapid reality shifting. So I'm super excited to release this training. I kind of go over more of expanding your consciousness and how to transform your reality with mindfulness techniques and introspection and self-awareness. I just kind of go deeper into these concepts. So if you want to learn more and dive deeper into these topics, I would love for you to join me. You could join the VIP waitlist at the link in my bio or in the show notes or description of this video. So I would love to have you on my waitlist, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.